The glass doors of St. Mary's Hospital hissed open with their usual pneumatic sigh, but what stepped inside was anything but usual. It wasn't a patient leaning on crutches, or a nurse hurrying back from a break, or even one of the city's frazzled paramedics wheeling in a gurney. No, it was a dog, a German shepherd, big enough to command attention, wearing a faded, battle-worn canine harness that told a story all on its own. The morning had been busy, the sort of busy where time seems to move in overlapping conversations. The beep of monitors blending with the faint buzz of the coffee machine in the break room. A child cried in pediatrics. The orthopedic wing was backed up. A nurse laughed loudly at something a colleague whispered. The rhythm was chaotic, but it was the kind of chaos everyone at St. Mary's knew well. And then the dog entered. Everything stilled, not all at once, but in that subtle, creeping way that happens when something is just different enough to pull attention. Conversations trailed off. A pen stopped scratching on a clipboard. One of the receptionists leaned forward in her chair, unsure if she was really seeing what she thought she was. He moved with purpose, no hesitation, no anxious darting glances the way lost pets often do. His head was low, eyes locked ahead like a soldier marching into enemy territory. His paws clicked against the polished floor with a rhythmic certainty, the sound oddly loud against the hush that was spreading through the lobby. His coat was patchy with dust and dirt, as if he'd been running through alleys or fields, but his muscles were taut, coiled with determination. It was the harness that caught most eyes, the heavy-duty type with reinforced stitching, a faded police canine patch still clinging to one side, frayed at the edges. It had clearly seen service. No one was holding his leash. In fact, there was no leash at all. Dr. Avery, who had been crossing the lobby with a stack of charts, froze mid-step. Years of emergency medicine had taught him to read situations instantly, and something about this dog didn't fit any normal pattern. "Where's his handler?" he murmured, scanning the entrance. No one followed. The dog ignored the desk entirely. He walked straight down the center of the lobby, weaving around a wheelchair without breaking stride. The automatic door sighed shut behind him, sealing the moment in. It was the eyes that unsettled people most. They weren't wild or panicked. They were locked in, purposeful, as if every step was part of a mission he had already planned. And then came the detail that changed everything. Nurse Maria Sanchez, head of triage and a woman who'd seen just about everything in her 20 years at St. Mary's, noticed it first. She had been standing beside the information desk, talking to a volunteer, when her gaze landed on the shepherd. Her eyes narrowed. Something dangled from his mouth. At first, she thought it might be a rag, maybe a discarded piece of fabric he'd picked up outside. But as he drew closer, her stomach tightened. This wasn't just fabric. It was torn cloth, ripped roughly along one edge, the kind of tearing that comes from a desperate tug, not clean scissors. It was soaked in a dark stain that left no doubt in her mind. Blood. She took a step forward. "Hey, boy." Her voice was calm, measured, but her pulse had picked up speed. The shepherd slowed as he reached her, his gaze flicking from her face to the floor and back again. Maria saw something glint beneath the folds of the cloth, a small, flat metal button, still attached to the fabric. Shirt material, maybe denim or heavy cotton. The blood had seeped deep into the fibers. Behind her, someone whispered, "Is that?" They didn't finish. The dog stopped just in front of her. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply dropped the fabric at her feet and looked straight at her. Not at her hands, not at her pockets for treats. Directly into her eyes. There was a plea in that look. It wasn't random. This was a message. A lobby felt frozen now. Every person caught in a strange shared silence. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to fade. Somewhere down the hall, A monitor beeped steadily, but here, the only sound was the faint metallic clink as the small button rolled slightly on the tile. Maria crouched slowly, keeping her movements deliberate, and picked up the cloth. It was heavier than she expected, stiff with dried blood in places, damp with fresh in others. Her nurse's instinct flared instantly, whoever this belonged, to needed help, and fast. She straightened, looking back at the shepherd. "Where?" she asked softly, almost reflexively, as though he could answer. The dog gave a single whine, low and urgent, then turned toward the door. He took 3 steps, paused, and glanced back over his shoulder. The message was clear. "Follow me." "Security," Maria said without taking her eyes off him. "Get 2 paramedics out here, now." One of the security guards moved quickly, pulling his radio to his mouth. The other stood frozen, watching as the dog paced toward the exit again, then back toward Maria, ears pricked forward in that strange mix of hope and insistence. The cloth in her hand was still warm. She glanced toward Dr. Avery. "This isn't a stray. This is a canine, and I think someone's out there bleeding right now." A ripple of realization passed through the small crowd that had formed. This wasn't just an odd moment anymore. It was urgent. The shepherd was no random visitor. He was the messenger for someone who couldn't get here themselves. The dog stepped forward again, almost impatient now, and gave another short, sharp whine. His nails clicked against the tile like a ticking clock, counting down seconds they couldn't afford to waste. Maria knew one thing for certain. If this dog had come all the way to them, there was a reason, and that reason might be dying somewhere. She tightened her grip on the bloodied cloth and nodded to the paramedics jogging over. "We're going with him," she said. And just like that, the quiet was broken, replaced by the rapid, coordinated movement of a team that had switched into emergency mode. But in those few seconds before they followed, there had been a silence so deep and strange that everyone who had been there would remember it for years. The day a dog walked in alone, carrying not just a clue, but a cry for help. The bloodied scrap of cloth lay in Maria's palm like a grim puzzle piece. It was heavy with meaning, not just because of the dark stains, but because of how it had been brought to her. A hospital receives evidence of injuries every day. Patients clutching a torn shirt or a blood-soaked towel. But this had been delivered by a dog, alone. The metal button still clinging to the fabric caught the fluorescent light, flashing briefly as Maria turned it over. The shirt material was coarse, likely from workwear, maybe construction or factory. She could see the jagged edges where it had ripped, fibers frayed outward as if wrenched with force. Her fingers brushed over it and found that certain spots were still tacky, fresh. Her stomach tightened. Whoever this belonged to was bleeding right now. The German shepherd's gaze stayed locked on her, unwavering. There was intelligence there, the kind you can't mistake for coincidence. He didn't just want attention. He was demanding it. Every flick of his ears, every tense line of muscle, every low whine told the same story. Time is running out. Maria lowered her voice, speaking to him like she would to a scared patient. "Where's your person?" The dog turned, trotting a few steps toward the automatic doors before glancing back, as if checking that she'd understood. When she didn't immediately move, he padded back to her, nudged her knee with his nose, then spun toward the doors again. The movement drew more onlookers. A couple of visitors waiting in line at reception stepped aside, unsure whether to be afraid or fascinated. One of the younger nurses whispered, "He's trained. You can see it. Look how he waits for you before moving." Security Officer Dan, tall and broad-shouldered, crouched slightly to get a better look at the harness. Old police K9 model. These straps aren't standard civilian gear, and He pointed to a faded patch on the side. PD Unit 73. That's this city's code. Bat confirmed it. This was no random stray. He was a retired or missing service dog, one who clearly still knew how to operate on a mission. The dog gave a single sharp bark. Heads turned instantly. His bark wasn't loud in the way untrained dogs bark. It was clipped, measured, like an alert. Maria felt her pulse jump. She'd seen that look before, back when her cousin had been a handler in the army. This wasn't a dog asking for help. This was a soldier giving an order. The other security guard, a younger man named Blake, stepped forward uncertainly. Should I call animal control? Or, no, Maria cut him off sharply. Call the local precinct. Ask if they've got a missing canine or handler down, and send 2 medics with me. We're following him. Blake hesitated for a second, but one look at her expression told him not to argue. The shepherd moved toward the door again. Tail held low but straight, ears fixed ahead. This wasn't the wagging, uncertain tail of a lost pet. It was the steady rudder of an animal who knew exactly where he was going. Grab the trauma bag, Maria said over her shoulder to one of the paramedics jogging toward her. We might be walking into a bleed-out. The dog stopped at the threshold of the sliding doors, waiting. It was uncanny, like he knew they had to gather supplies before following. When Maria stepped outside, the cold winter air bit into her cheeks. The dog immediately set off at a brisk pace down the sidewalk, looking back every few seconds. To ensure the humans kept up, his paws made soft thuds on the concrete, quick and deliberate. It wasn't long before Maria noticed something else. Faint, irregular drops of red staining the sidewalk in a scattered trail. She crouched mid-stride to touch one with her glove. Blood? She quickened her pace. The streets grew quieter as they moved away from the hospital's main entrance, past storefronts with closed signs and into an older industrial block. The shepherd moved without hesitation, cutting across an empty parking lot, tail flicking slightly as if catching a scent in the air. Maria's mind raced. The fabric in her pocket, the blood drops, the purposeful movement. It all pointed to one conclusion. Whoever this man or woman was, they'd been unable to get help themselves. And this dog, somehow, had taken it upon himself to bridge the gap. She'd seen amazing things in her career. Strangers saving strangers, people finding impossible reserves of strength in emergencies. But never this. Never an animal orchestrating a rescue like a trained first responder. A muffled groan carried on the wind, faint, almost drowned by the sound of their footsteps. The shepherd stopped dead in his tracks, ears swiveling. His head snapped to the left, toward a half-finished construction site, shielded by chain-link fencing. Maria followed his gaze. The fencing had a gap near one corner, bent outward just enough for a large dog to slip through. Without hesitation, he darted in, weaving between piles of sandbags and stacked timber. Over here, Maria shouted to the paramedics as she pushed through the opening. The site was eerily silent. No workers, no machinery running. Just the cold bite of wind and the skeletal frame of a building in progress. The shepherd slowed as he approached a section of collapsed scaffolding. Metal poles lay scattered, like broken matchsticks, planks twisted and splintered. The sharp tongue of blood mixed with the scent of rust and dust. Then she saw him. A man lay partially wedged under the wreckage, one leg trapped beneath a heavy beam. His shirt, or what was left of it, was the exact match to the torn scrap in her pocket. His skin was ashen, lips tinged blue, and his breaths came shallow and quick. Maria dropped to her knees beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered weakly. The shepherd circled them, whining, then pressed his nose to the man's face as if urging him to stay awake. One paramedic was already unzipping the trauma bag. Pulse is weak. We need to free him now or he's going into shock. Maria gripped the man's hand. You're going to be okay. We've got you. But in her mind, she knew the truth. Without the shepherd's intervention, they wouldn't even be here. And judging by the pooling blood beneath the beam, they might have been minutes too late. The man's breathing was shallow, each inhale rattling as if it cost him effort. His leg was pinned under the thick metal beam, and the wood around it was slick with blood. Maria's eyes darted to the wound. She could see a deep gash in his thigh, where jagged metal had bitten into muscle. His femoral artery might be compromised, one paramedic muttered, already pulling out gauze and a tourniquet. The shepherd paced in tight circles, whining in short bursts, unable to stand still. He kept glancing between the man's face and the paramedic's hands, his tail flicking like a metronome ticking off precious seconds. Let's get this off him, Maria said firmly. We don't have time to wait for backup. One paramedic, Tony, knelt on the opposite side of the beam. On 3, you lift. I'll stabilize his leg. Maria planted her boots against the gravel and gripped the cold steel. 1, 2, 3. The beam was heavier than she'd expected, biting into her gloves as she strained. Tony slid the man's leg free, immediately wrapping the tourniquet above the wound and tightening, until the blood flow slowed to a dark, sluggish seep. The man let out a faint groan, his head lolling to the side. Stay with us, sir, Maria urged. She reached for her radio. We've got a male, approximately late 30s, construction accident, heavy blood loss. We need an ambulance at 5th. And Howard, northeast corner of the construction site. Critical condition. The voice on the other end crackled acknowledgement. While Tony checked the man's vitals, the other paramedic, Sarah, prepared a saline 4. Maria glanced at the shepherd. He had stopped pacing now, sitting beside the man's head with perfect stillness. His amber eyes didn't waver from the injured man's face. There was no question now. This wasn't just a random Good Samaritan dog. This was someone's partner, someone's family. And he wasn't leaving until his human was safe. Maria bent down and stroked the shepherd's neck briefly. You did good, boy. Real good. The dog's ears twitched at her voice, but his eyes never left the man. The distant wail of an ambulance siren began to thread through the air, faint but growing. Maria took a deep breath and allowed herself a glance at the surroundings. The collapsed scaffold told part of the story, but not all of it. The break in the fencing where the dog had entered wasn't large, and the trail of faint blood drops they'd followed here had been scattered. That meant the man had been conscious, at least for a while, after the fall. Conscious enough to realize he couldn't get help himself. She imagined it. The man pinned, struggling to breathe, fumbling to tear a piece of his shirt with shaking hands, pressing it into the dog's mouth. Maybe speaking words the dog had heard countless times in training. Find help. And the shepherd ranger, she would later learn, had obeyed without hesitation. The sound of the approaching ambulance grew sharper, echoing between the unfinished building's steel frame and the nearby warehouses. Sarah secured the IV and nodded to Maria. He's holding on, but we've got to move. Tony and Maria exchanged a look. The man's pulse was weak, and even with the bleeding slowed, shock was setting in fast. The shepherd rose and stepped back a few feet, as if understanding they needed space to work. His body was tense, tail low, head following every movement. Within moments, the ambulance screeched to a stop outside the fence. 2 EMTs jogged in with a stretcher, their boots crunching over gravel. What have we got? One asked. Construction collapse, probable femoral bleed, tourniquet applied, 4 started, Maria recited quickly. Vitals unstable, but holding. They worked with efficient speed, transferring the man onto the stretcher and securing his leg for transport. And then something happened that made every person there pause. As the stretcher began to move toward the ambulance, the shepherd fell into step beside it, not in front, not behind, but right next to the injured man's head. His pace matched theirs perfectly, his body angled protectively. "He's not going to want to stay behind," Tony murmured. Maria hesitated. Normally, animals weren't allowed to ride in emergency vehicles. But looking at the shepherd, at the unwavering focus in his eyes, she knew separating them now would be wrong. She turned to the lead EMT. "Let him ride. He won't get in the way." The EMT hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Fine. Back corner. Just keep him clear of the equipment." When they loaded the stretcher into the ambulance, the shepherd jumped in without being called, settling himself in the narrow space by the man's side. He rested his head lightly on the edge of the gurney, his nose just inches from the man's arm. Maria stepped back, exhaling hard as the rear doors slammed shut. The siren wailed again, and the ambulance sped away toward St. Mary's. She stood there for a long moment, the winter wind biting through her scrubs, before finally looking down at her gloved hands. The fabric scrap was still in her pocket, the blood already drying stiff. If that dog hadn't brought it to the hospital, they never would have known where to find him. And judging by the amount of blood, they would have been too late. The ambulance doors swung open in a rush of cold air and urgency. Inside, the German shepherd remained exactly where he had been for the entire ride, pressed close to the stretcher, head hovering just inches from the man's limp hand. Paramedics had worked around him without protest. He seemed to understand instinctively when to move, when to stay perfectly still. "Let's move," a nurse shouted as the gurney's wheels hit the pavement. The E-team was already waiting. At the bay doors, alerted by Maria's earlier call, floodlights bathed the scene in harsh white, throwing sharp shadows across the shepherd's face. His eyes, though calm, never left the man he had brought here. As the team rushed through the automatic doors into Trauma Room 3, the shepherd tried to follow, but a security guard stepped into his path. "No animals past this point," the guard began automatically, but his voice faltered under the weight of Maria's glare. "He's coming," she said firmly, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "He's not just an animal. He's the reason this man's alive." The guard hesitated only a beat before stepping aside. The shepherd padded in silently, his nails clicking softly against the tile, tail low but steady. Inside the trauma room, the air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the rapid-fire commands of the medical team. A monitor beeped in short, urgent bursts. The man's leg was a mess of blood-soaked bandages, with a tourniquet held firm. His pulse, faint but present, flashed across the screen in pale green. "Pressure's dropping," a doctor called. "Let's get him prepped for surgery now." The shepherd stood off to the side, close enough to see his human, but far enough not to interfere. His head tilted slightly each time the man groaned or shifted. It was as if he was reading every change in the man's condition. Maria stepped back, letting the surgeons take over. She found herself leaning against the wall, the adrenaline from the rescue starting to ebb, replaced by a strange awe. She'd worked in emergency medicine for over 2 decades, but she had never seen a chain of events quite like this. She caught sight of the bloodied cloth still tucked into her pocket. Pulling it out, she turned it over in her hands again, tracing the jagged tear. Something about the workmanship of the fabric, the reinforced stitching, nagged at her. A voice behind her interrupted her thoughts. "Is that Ranger?" Maria turned to see a uniformed police officer standing in the doorway, his face pale with shock. He was in his mid-40s, solid build, with a look of disbelief that was almost childlike. "You know this dog?" she asked. The officer stepped inside slowly, his gaze fixed on the shepherd. Everyone in the precinct knows him. That's Ranger. Retired K-9, served with Officer Daniel Price until he trailed off, swallowing hard. Until Daniel was killed in a car accident 2 years ago. Maria's eyes widened. And this man? She gestured toward the patient. The officer looked over at the stretcher, his expression tightening. That's Tom Price, Daniel's younger brother. The room seemed to still for a moment. The connection snapped into place with startling clarity. Ranger hadn't just found anyone in trouble. He had found his person. The man who had taken him in after his handler, Daniel, was gone. Maria exhaled slowly. That means he ran to the only place he knew people would help, the officer finished. Daniel used to bring him here for community visits, didn't he? Maria nodded. Plenty of times. He must have remembered. They both looked at Ranger. He stood like a statue, eyes locked on Tom, his entire posture radiating a fierce, patient loyalty. The officer stepped closer and crouched beside him. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his hand resting lightly on the shepherd's shoulder. Ranger's ear flicked in acknowledgement, but he didn't turn his head. His focus was absolute. One of the surgical nurses approached. "We're taking him to OR now. If you want the dog to stay close, someone will need to accompany him through pre-op." Maria glanced at the officer. "You up for it?" "Wouldn't trust anyone else," he said. They wheeled Tom out, Ranger padding alongside, his gait perfectly in sync with the gurney's movement. Every now and then, he'd glance up at Tom's face, as if reassuring himself that his human was still here, still breathing. As they reached the double doors of the surgical wing, the lead surgeon gave a small shake of his head. "No animals in the OR." Maria crouched in front of Ranger, looking him square in the eyes. "They're going to help him. You did your job. Let them do theirs now." For a long moment, the shepherd didn't move. Then, with a low sigh that sounded almost human, he stepped back. The officer took hold of his harness gently, leading him to a bench just outside the operating area. The doors swung shut behind the surgical team, and the hallway was left in a tense, waiting quiet. Ranger lay down with a heavy thud, front, paws crossed, eyes never leaving the door. The officer sat beside him, absently running a hand over his head in slow, steady strokes. 2 years, the officer said quietly, more to himself than to Maria. 2 years since Daniel died, and that dog still acts like every day's a shift, like he's still on duty. Maria folded her arms, the fabric scrap clutched in one hand. Today he was. The minutes stretched into an hour, then another. Nurses passed by, some stopping to give Ranger a soft pat, others simply offering a quiet smile. Every time footsteps echoed down the hall, Ranger's ears would perk, only to settle again when it wasn't the news he was waiting for. Finally, the surgeon emerged, peeling off his mask. "He's stable. Lost a lot of blood, but we repaired the artery. He's going to need a long recovery, but he's going to make it." The officer's shoulders sagged with relief. Ranger, sensing the shift in energy, rose to his feet and wagged his tail slowly. The first sign of relaxation since they'd found Tom. "You can see him," the surgeon added. "He's still under, but he should wake soon." As they ellied Ranger into the recovery room, Maria felt a lump form in her throat. The shepherd walked right up to the bedside, resting his chin gently on the edge, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of Tom's chest. For the first time since entering the hospital that morning, Ranger closed his eyes. Mission complete. The ICU at St. Mary's had seen its share of emergencies, but the combination of a critically injured man and a police-trained canine sitting vigil at his bedside was something that drew quiet glances from staff. Ranger hadn't moved much since. The surgeons had wheeled his handler, now identified as Officer Daniel Hayes, out of the operating room. The shepherd's massive frame was curled beside the hospital bed, his head resting on his paws, eyes locked on Daniel's still form. Dr. Patel, the attending physician, had been honest with Maria in the hallway. The surgery went well in terms of controlling the bleed and stabilizing the fracture. But the delay in treatment caused significant blood loss. The next 24 hours are critical. If infection sets in, or if his body can't handle the trauma. She let the unfinished sentence hang heavy in the sterile air. Maria nodded grimly. She'd heard it before. She'd also seen people pull through by sheer willpower, sometimes spurred by nothing more than a voice they loved or a presence they trusted. And judging by the way Ranger's ears flicked every time Daniel's heart monitor beeped, that presence might already be working its quiet magic. By late evening, the ICU had settled into its usual strange rhythm, a mix of hushed voices, distant monitors, and the occasional hurried footsteps of nurses responding to an urgent call. Ranger barely reacted when staff entered the room now. As long as they moved with purpose toward Daniel, he stayed calm. But if anyone lingered near the bed without touching him, Ranger's head would lift slowly, his amber eyes locking onto theirs in silent scrutiny. No growl, no bark, just a warning look that spoke louder than sound. Maria came in during one of her short breaks, carrying a paper cup of coffee she didn't particularly want, but needed to stay awake. "How's he doing?" she asked softly, glancing toward the monitor. "Stable for now," replied Nurse Howard, checking the 4 line. "Blood pressure's holding, oxygen looks good. Still no sign of waking, though." Ranger's gaze shifted to Maria briefly before returning to Daniel. She reached down and brushed her fingers along his head. "You're a good partner," she murmured. The dog's eyes closed for a moment at her touch, then opened again, still fixed on Daniel, as if afraid the man would vanish if he looked away. At around 2 a.m., Daniel's fingers twitched. It was small, the kind of movement most might dismiss as reflex. But Ranger noticed instantly. His head lifted, ears fully erect. Maria saw it too. She leaned closer. "Daniel? Can you hear me?" The man's eyelids fluttered, then half opened, revealing unfocused eyes. He swallowed weakly, his dry lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. Ranger let out a low, rumbling whine, a sound equal parts relief and encouragement. Daniel's gaze shifted toward the noise. Recognition sparked in his eyes, faint but unmistakable. His lips formed one silent word: Ranger. Maria felt a tightness in her throat. "He's right here," she assured him. "You're at St. Mary's Hospital. You've been in surgery, but you're safe now." The officer's eyes flickered. Toward her, then back to Ranger. His breathing hitched, but this time from something like relief rather than pain. The shepherd, unable to hold back any longer, stood and rested his front paws gently on the edge of the bed, leaning close enough that Daniel could feel the warm brush of fur against his hand. Daniel's fingers curled weakly into the thick ruff of his partner's neck. Over the next few hours, the room seemed to shift. Daniel's color improved slightly, his responses growing more coherent. He still spoke little, but every time Ranger moved even a few feet away for water or a brief walk with Maria, Daniel's eyes would follow until the dog returned. By morning, the ICU attending was cautiously optimistic. "He's not out of the woods," Dr. Patel warned, "but his vitals are stronger than I expected at this stage." Maria suspected she knew why. Word of the unusual patient-guardian pairing spread quietly through the hospital. Orderlies and nurses would occasionally peek in, catching sight of the shepherd lying beside the bed, his tail thumping softly whenever Daniel stirred. Some whispered about the blood-stained cloth Ranger had carried into the E, how it had led directly to finding Daniel in time. Others marveled at the loyalty it must have taken for the dog to navigate from a chaotic accident site all the way. To the hospital, carrying proof of his handler's condition. For Ranger, none of that mattered. His world began and ended at Daniel's bedside. He accepted water when offered, ate only when Maria coaxed him, and slept in short bursts, always, waking at the slightest movement or sound from the man in the bed. One afternoon, as Daniel drifted into a deeper, more natural sleep, Maria sat on the windowsill, watching Ranger watch his partner. "You know," she said quietly, "if it weren't for you, we wouldn't be here right now." He wouldn't be here. The dog didn't respond in the human sense, but his ears swiveled toward her voice. She leaned forward slightly. "I've seen a lot of things in my career, but I've never seen loyalty like that." Ranger blinked slowly, as if accepting the observation without pride. It was then that Maria noticed something small, but telling. Ranger's gaze occasionally drifted not just to Daniel, but to the officer's belt hanging on the chair nearby. The leather was scuffed, the badge glinting faintly in the light. He wasn't just guarding a man. He was guarding a partner, a role, a life they had built together. On the 5th night, Daniel's condition took a sudden dip. His fever spiked, and his breathing became labored. The IQ team moved quickly, ordering cultures, adjusting antibiotics, and increasing fluids. Through it all, Ranger stood at the far end of the bed, tense but silent, as if sensing the urgency. Hours passed before the fever broke, and Daniel's breathing eased again. When it did, Ranger finally allowed himself to lie down, his body stretched protectively along the side of the bed, one paw lightly touching the blanket. Maria, exhausted but relieved, exhaled slowly. "You're watching over him better than any of us," she said. In the silence that followed, she realized something. The story was no longer just about the incredible way Ranger had brought Daniel here. It was about the fight happening now. A fight neither of them was willing to lose, and it was far from over. The 6th morning after Daniel Hayes was wheeled into St. Mary's, the ICU felt strangely brighter. It wasn't because of the weather. In fact, a gray drizzle streaked the windows. The shift came from within the room itself. Daniel was awake, sitting propped up against pillows, his eyes clearer than they had been in days. And Ranger was lying stretched out beside the bed, but this time his posture was less tense. His head rested comfortably on his paws, one ear angled toward his partner, as if ready to listen to every breath. Maria walked in with a clipboard and a faint smile. "You're looking better," she said, glancing between Daniel and the monitor. "Vitals are holding steady, the infection's under control, and you've got someone here who refuses to leave your side." Daniel's lips curved in the faintest smile. His voice was rough from days of intubation and dehydration, but the words came through. "He never has." Ranger lifted his head at the sound, tail thumping softly. It wasn't long before curiosity pressed Maria forward. She had pieced together fragments from first responders, from hospital gossip, from the bloodied cloth Ranger had carried into the EA, but there were still gaps in the story, pieces only Daniel could fill in. She pulled up a chair. "Do you feel like talking about what happened?" Daniel's eyes went distant for a moment, as though rewinding events in his mind. "We were called to a suspected break-in," he began slowly. "Old construction site, half-finished building. I'd been there before for trespassing calls. Nothing dangerous." He coughed lightly, and Maria passed him a sip of water. "This time," he continued, "it wasn't kids looking for a thrill. The place had been taken over by a small crew running stolen goods through one of the storage areas. I saw movement inside, went in with Ranger. His jaw tightened. It was quiet, too quiet, and something shifted above me. Loose scaffolding. I didn't even have time to react before it came down." Maria imagined the chaos, the metallic crash, the weight pinning him. You were trapped? Pinned at the leg, Daniel confirmed. Bad angle, a steel beam across my thigh. Ranger tried to pull it off, but it wouldn't budge. I could feel. Something wasn't right internally. He paused, eyes flicking toward his partner. I told him to stay, but he wouldn't. The next part made Maria's chest tighten. I carry an emergency med kit on my belt, Daniel said, and inside, a strip of cloth from my old academy shirt. It's sentimental. Ranger knows it's mine. I took it out, pressed it into his mouth, and told him to find help. Maria glanced at Ranger, suddenly understanding the significance of that blood-stained scrap. He didn't just run, Daniel said. He had to get past the men who are still inside. I heard him growl once, the kind of growl he only uses when he means business, and then silence. Next thing I knew, I was alone. Maria imagined the shepherd moving through the half-lit skeleton of the building, carrying the scrap in. His mouth dodging shadows and unfriendly hands. He must have followed the sirens, Daniel said. Or maybe he just knew where to go. His voice softened. Either way, the next time I saw him was here. There was a silence. After that, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Maria leaned back. You realize, she said, he probably saved your life twice. First by getting help. Then by sitting here making sure you didn't give up. Daniel looked down at the shepherd. He's done that more times than I can count. Ranger shifted closer to the bed, resting his chin on Daniel's leg, carefully avoiding the injured thigh. The gesture was quiet, but loaded with meaning. That afternoon, word of Daniel's recovery began to spread through the station. Officers stopped by in pairs to check in, some bringing small treats for Ranger. Others simply stood in the doorway, shaking their heads at the sight of the famously disciplined canine lounging like a house pet beside his handler. Sergeant Blake was among the visitors. He was a stocky man with a gruff voice, but when he spoke to Daniel, his tone softened. You scared the hell out of all of us, Blake said. Dispatch lost contact, and the next thing we hear, you're dogs walking into a hospital, carrying what looks like evidence from a crime scene. Daniel chuckled weakly. Sounds about right. Blake crouched down, scratching Ranger behind the ears. You're a damn good cop, he told the shepherd. Might be the only one in this city who doesn't need backup. Ranger accepted. The praise without breaking his stoic expression, but his tail swished against the floor. That night, when visiting hours ended and the hallway quieted, Maria found herself lingering in the doorway again. Daniel was drifting toward sleep, but his hand rested in Ranger's fur, fingers curling slightly with each breath. She thought about what Daniel had said, about the beam pinning him, about sending Ranger away. What struck her most wasn't the bravery in the dog's run to the hospital, though that alone was remarkable. It was the unspoken trust between them, the kind of trust built over years of working side by side. In moments where hesitation could mean the difference between life and death, Maria had seen loyalty before. But this was something rarer. Loyalty with intelligence, loyalty with agency. Ranger hadn't just obeyed an order. He'd understood the urgency, the stakes, and the need to act beyond the boundaries of his training. And that, she realized, was why he hadn't left Daniel's side since. His job wasn't finished until his partner walked out of here on his own 2 feet. The rain continued the next day, streaking the glass in the IQ window. Daniel was stronger. Now able to sit up for longer stretches, even eat small portions of food. Ranger remained his constant shadow. Nurses joked that they should put a badge on the dog and assign him a patient list, since he was more attentive than half the interns. Daniel smiled more now, but Maria noticed his eyes occasionally drifting toward the door, not with impatience, but with the quiet readiness of someone who wanted to get back to his life. Soon, she assured him, we'll get you through rehab first. He glanced at Ranger, then back at her. "We will," he said firmly. "Both of us." That evening, as the lights dimmed and the hospital settled into its nighttime, rhythm, Maria saw Ranger shift slightly closer to the bed, his head lifting as though he'd heard something only he could detect. Daniel stirred, opening his eyes. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. The shepherd gave a low, quiet chuff. Not alarm, not warning, just a subtle acknowledgement. Maria didn't know what it meant, but Daniel seemed to. He reached down, fingers, brushing the fur at Ranger's neck. "We're going home soon," he whispered. "You know it too, don't you?" The dog's tail thumped once against the bed frame. And in that moment, Maria knew they weren't just talking about leaving the hospital. They were talking about returning to the life they shared, the streets they patrolled, the calls they answered, the bond that neither injury nor time could break. The hardest part, however, was yet to come. Because when Daniel finally walked out of St. Mary's, he and Ranger would face the people responsible for the accident, and they would need to do it together. Tom's eyelids fluttered open to the soft hum of medical machines. For a moment, everything was a blur, the ceiling above him, pale and sterile, the quiet rustle of curtains shifting with the draft from a nearby vent, the faint antiseptic scent in the air. It took a few seconds before the events of the past day came rushing back, colliding in his mind like pieces of a fractured puzzle. The scaffold, the crushing pain in his leg, the cold metal pressing against his ribs. And then, darkness. Tom blinked again, his eyes adjusting to the dim hospital light. That's when he noticed a shape at the foot of his bed, still, patient and familiar. Ranger. The old German shepherd lay on his side, head resting on his paws, ears twitching at the occasional sound from the hallway. His breathing was steady. But the moment Tom's eyes opened fully, the dog's head lifted, and his amber gaze locked onto his. It wasn't the gaze of an ordinary pet. There was something deeply knowing in those eyes, a recognition that cut through Tom's fog of pain and exhaustion. "Hey, buddy," Tom whispered, his voice hoarse. At the sound, Ranger's tail gave a slow, deliberate thump against the floor. Not frantic, not excited, just one heavy beat, as if to say, "I'm here." Tom reached out, though the forelines tugged gently against his arm. His fingers brushed the coarse fur along Ranger's neck, and for the first time since the accident, a sense of calm washed over him. The memories became clearer now, like pieces falling into place. He remembered lying in that ditch, pinned and helpless, tasting blood in his mouth. The world had been shrinking to a pinpoint of light, and then Ranger's face had been there. Tom hadn't been able to speak, but the dog had acted without hesitation, tearing a strip from his shirt, sprinting away into the unknown, finding help. The thought made Tom's throat tighten. He glanced toward the doorway and saw Maria, the head nurse who had first met Ranger in the A, peeking in with a soft smile. Behind her, a couple of other nurses lingered, clearly curious. Word of Ranger's actions had spread through the hospital like wildfire. "Looks like someone's been waiting for you all night," Maria said gently, stepping inside. Tom managed a weak grin. I should be thanking him first, before anyone else. Maria came closer, resting a hand on the bedrail. "He hasn't moved since we brought you out of surgery. Wouldn't even take a drink of water, unless we left the cup next to your bed." She glanced down at Ranger, shaking her head in quiet amazement. It's like he knows exactly what happened. Tom's eyes softened. "He knows. Trust me, he knows." For a while, they just sat there in silence. Tom stroking Ranger's fur, Maria checking his vitals without breaking. The peaceful moment. The beeping of the heart monitor was steady now, no longer the frantic rhythm it had been hours earlier. Tom leaned back against the pillows, his mind drifting to memories of Daniel, his older brother. He could see Daniel's broad smile, The way he used to pat Ranger's side after a good day's work. Daniel had been more than just Ranger's handler. He had been his partner, his anchor. And when Daniel had died in that accident, Tom had taken Ranger in, thinking he was doing the dog a favor. But now, lying in that hospital bed, Tom realized it might have been the other way around. "You saved me, Ranger," Tom murmured, almost to himself. Ranger's ears perked at the sound of his name. He shifted closer to the bed, resting his chin on the mattress so that his eyes were level with Tom's. Tom placed his hand gently over the dog's muzzle, feeling the warmth, the steady pulse of life beneath his skin. The door creaked open again, and this time a pair of uniformed officers entered. One was Officer Lewis, a man who had worked alongside Daniel years ago. His expression softened when he saw Tom awake. "Well, I'll be damned," Lewis said, stepping forward. "The stubborn Price boys. Guess it runs in the family, never knowing when to quit." Tom chuckled weakly, though it made his ribs ache. "Guess I got it from my brother." Lewis nodded, then crouched down to give Ranger a scratch behind the ears. "I've seen this dog do some incredible things in the line of duty, but this takes the cake. He didn't just find help. He went to the exact place he knew would save you. Straight to the A, no hesitation." Tom's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't from pain. It was from the sheer magnitude of what Ranger had done. "He's still a cop at heart," Tom said quietly. Lewis smiled faintly. "Yeah, but I think he's your guardian now." The conversation drifted after that, but the atmosphere in the room stayed warm, almost sacred. Nurses came and went, but they always glanced toward Ranger, some even bending down to give him a quick pat. Patients passing in wheelchairs slowed to smile at the sight. And through it all, Ranger never moved far from Tom's side. By evening, the sky outside the hospital window had turned a deep shade of indigo. The hallway lights dimmed slightly, and the activity on the ward slowed to a quiet hum. Tom lay in bed, his leg aching, but his mind strangely at peace. "Remember Daniel, boy?" he whispered. "He'd be proud of you. Real proud." Ranger's tail gave another slow, measured thump. For the first time since the accident, Tom allowed himself to truly rest. His eyelids grew heavy, and his breathing slowed. He knew he wasn't alone. Not now, not ever. The bond between them wasn't just forged in the chaos of the accident. It had been building for years, from the first moment Ranger had stepped into his brother's life, to the day Tom had taken him in, to this very moment in the hospital room. It was a bond written in loyalty, in trust, and in something deeper than words. When Tom finally drifted into sleep, Ranger stayed exactly where he was, a silent sentinel in the night. The hospital around them carried on, nurses walking softly, machines humming, but inside room 214, time seemed to hold still. Because in that quiet space, the man who had nearly died and the dog who had saved him were together again, and neither was going to let go. And somewhere, in a place beyond words, Tom knew his brother was smiling. The rain had stopped by the time Tom was discharged from the hospital, though the clouds still hung low and heavy over the small town. The air smelled of wet asphalt and fresh earth, and the streets glistened in the dim afternoon light. Tom eased himself into the passenger seat of Officer Lewis's patrol car, his crutches awkwardly folded at his side. Ranger was already inside, sitting upright in the back, his amber eyes fixed on Tom like a watchful guardian. The moment Tom settled in, the shepherd let out a quiet, satisfied sigh, as though confirming to himself that the mission wasn't over yet. The ride home was quiet. Tom watched the familiar streets pass by, but they looked different now. Every storefront, every intersection, every flickering street lamp felt sharper, more meaningful, as if survival itself had given him new eyes. When they pulled into his driveway, Tom was greeted by the sight of a small crowd gathered near the eye. Porch, neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers stood with warm smiles and murmured congratulations. A banner hung between the porch posts. "Welcome home, Tom and Ranger." Tom swallowed the lump in his throat. He wasn't one for public attention, but this was different. This was about the dog beside him. As soon as Tom stepped out, leaning on his crutches, Ranger leapt gracefully from the back seat. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ranger, as if sensing the moment, stood tall, ears perked, gaze steady. He didn't bark, didn't fidget. He simply absorbed the recognition with quiet dignity, the way only a seasoned canine could. Maria, the nurse who had first witnessed Ranger in the Aya, was among the group. She handed Tom a small envelope. "This came in for you while you were still in recovery," she said with a gentle smile. Tom opened it slowly, revealing a letter. On crisp stationery, the handwriting was neat, deliberate. "Dear Tom, news travels fast in this town, and when I heard what Ranger did, I knew I had to write. I served with your brother Daniel. He always said that Ranger wasn't just his partner. He was family. What Ranger did for you proves he's still serving, still protecting, just like Daniel taught him. I hope you know that in a way, your brother was with you out there. Take care of him, Tom, and let him take care of you." Captain Harris Tom's grip on the paper tightened, his vision blurring for a moment. He looked down at Ranger, who met his gaze without flinching, as if understanding every word. Inside the house, Tom lowered himself into the warm leather armchair by the window. Ranger settled on the rug nearby, curling into a perfect circle, but keeping one ear cocked toward the front door. Old habits die hard for a dog who had spent years in service. Over the next week, life took on a strange rhythm. Tom's injuries forced him to slow down, but Ranger seemed to intuitively match his pace. When Tom struggled with his crutches, Ranger walked beside him, his body close enough to act as a brace. When Tom couldn't sleep, Ranger's steady breathing on the floor beside his bed lulled him back into rest. But the biggest change wasn't in the quiet moments. It was in how people in town began to see them. One morning, a local journalist knocked on Tom's door, notebook in hand, asking for the full story. At first, Tom hesitated. The accident had been harrowing, and reliving it wasn't easy. But when he glanced at Ranger, lying calmly at his feet, he knew the story wasn't about his pain. It was about the dog who had refused to give up on him. The article was published 2 days later, and within hours, Tom's phone began buzzing with messages. Former officers who had worked with Daniel called to congratulate Ranger. Families wrote emails thanking him for his service and for inspiring them to cherish their own pets. By the end of the week, the local K-9 unit invited Tom and Ranger to a small ceremony at the precinct. The day of the event, Tom wore his brother's old service jacket, not to draw attention to himself, but to carry a piece of Daniel with him. Ranger, too, seemed to sense the importance of the day. His coat gleamed, and he walked with that measured, deliberate stride that had once made him a force to be reckoned with on the job. Inside the precinct, the chief addressed the gathered officers. Today, we honor not only a retired K-9 who served this community with distinction, he began, his voice carrying over the quiet room, but also a dog who proved that service doesn't end with retirement. Ranger, through courage, intelligence, and unwavering loyalty, saved the life of his handler's brother. That kind of devotion is rare in humans or animals. The chief motioned for Tom to step forward. He did so slowly, leaning on his crutches, and Ranger came to stand beside him. "This," the chief continued, holding up a small medal, attached to a blue ribbon, "is the Medal of Valor. It's awarded for acts of extraordinary bravery. And while Ranger may not understand the words, he certainly understands the meaning." Tom knelt carefully, and the chief draped the ribbon over Ranger's neck. The dog stood perfectly still, his eyes scanning the faces in the room before finally settling back on Tom. For a moment, it was as if the air itself held still. No one clapped immediately. They just took in the sight of the old shepherd. Wearing the medal, the way his tail gave a slow, dignified wag. And then the applause came, loud and sustained, echoing off the walls. That night, back at home, Tom set the medal on the mantelpiece, right beside a framed photo of Daniel and Ranger from years ago. The photograph showed Daniel kneeling with his arm around the dog, both of them looking straight into the camera with that same unwavering focus. Tom sat down beside Ranger on the floor, resting his hand on the dog's neck. "You did it, boy," he said quietly. "You kept your promise, to him and to me." Ranger leaned into the touch, closing his eyes. In the weeks that followed, Tom's legs slowly healed, and life began to resemble something close to normal. But the bond between man and dog was no longer just companionship. It was a living legacy of trust, sacrifice, and love. On quiet evenings, Tom would find himself looking at the medal and the photograph on the mantel. He'd think about how close he'd come to never making it home, and how a single decision, Ranger tearing off with that piece of cloth, had changed everything. And sometimes, when the house was still and the world outside seemed far away, Tom would speak softly into the dim light. "Thank you, Daniel," he'd say, "for sending him to me." Ranger, without fail, would lift his head at the sound of his name and thump his tail against the floor. It was in those moments Tom realized that some bonds don't break with time or distance or even death. They live on, in the watchful eyes of a faithful dog, in the quiet courage to act without hesitation, and in the knowledge that sometimes the heroes we need the most walk on four legs. And for Tom, that was enough, because as long as Ranger was by his side, Daniel's spirit was never far away.